the independent chair to the local safeguarding children's board here in Middlesbrough. First of all, I want to say thank you for coming tonight and delivering the presentations that you have done. But I'm going to follow that up with a challenge, which is not just for me, it's for the town. Excuse me, is that not working? Yeah, I'm going to follow that up with a challenge, not just for me and the safeguarding board, but for the town and the communities that live here in Middlesbrough. It's been referred to 3 times during the course of the presentations. Institutional silence, institutional walls of silence within the communities that we have, not just here in Middlesbrough, but across the country. Question, challenge, how are we going to break those barriers down? What models have been developed elsewhere that perhaps we could utilise here in Middlesbrough to start to really break down this institutional silence that is clearly out there across our communities?
So you want to start with that?
All right, I'll go for it.
He does love to talk.
All right.
Right.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to hog the kind of mic. Look, I think one of the most important ways to start breaking down the walls of silence is that we have to start talking about the issue. And you've just heard some powerful testimony already. And we don't, you know, I've got to say, policymakers, and I'm looking at it from the institutional point of view, when it comes to policymakers, I often say, and being an elected member myself, by the time we hear things get to policy level, they're so sanitised, we never hear the angry voice of a young person who's being abused or a person who's been, and we need to hear that voice, and we need to see that reality. You need to walk the streets at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, and you'll see that there are children out there on the streets, and there are predatory individuals who are trying to groom them and target them, and you need to see that reality. So we need to make our policy real. We can't be 4 or 5 steps removed from the reality of what's going on, and we've got to talk about to the real stakeholders, not the usual suspects, you know, the people who are gatekeepers, who are complicit in maintaining a status quo. And then, you know, and we've got to bring people into our organisations. Like I said, most of my staff will not work in many of the organisations and institutions, but you know what? They will give you, they'll reach the places that most people can't reach, and they'll give you the perspectives that you really want. They'll go down an alley at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. They'll go to a park at 1 o'clock at night. They'll go into a shisha bar at 12 at night, and they'll go and disrupt and interrupt. And we're not bringing people like that into our frameworks, into our institutions, who challenge the perspective and challenge the organisational culture. And so therefore we have individuals who maintain the status quo. And I say the one thing, you know, that we so lack, and I always say the biggest draw in the world is compassion and love and humanising the individuals we're talking about. We just see them as a set of symptoms and problems and dysfunctions, not as our children. And I think that's a real part of shifting the kind of perspectives. In relation to breaking the walls of silence in the communities, it's getting out there and getting the disclosures and getting the prosecutions and getting those people brave enough to speak. I'll just give you one example. There was an imam in Bradford who was abusing 5 children. I got the disclosure, so I got social services straight involved straight away. By the time we went to take the statements, because of the community issues and this is going to be a dishonour and all that, it was brushed under the carpet. None of the families wanted to make statements, and we've got to be able to empower. These are very powerful individuals, and it takes time. But and you've got to empower the people who are actually doing that work. And eventually those, and we see, and I want to see prosecutions. People say, oh, because it sends out the message that we show solidarity with the victims, not with the abusers. And you'll see that when we start to actually engage at that level, then I think you'll break down those walls of silence. And we've got to just not turn a blind eye to the statistics. You know, if, for example, there is a particular community in your locality, okay, and we're finding that we're not picking up any cases of intra-family or intra-community sexual abuse, it only means 2 things. One, it's not happening. And obviously that's not the case, because it happens in every single community. Okay, or the second thing, it's being covered up, it's being suppressed. And we are not reaching it, so we need to make sure that we work with the people who can engage in those spaces. And the walls of silence and the institutions and the cultures, you know, Oxbridge, you know, like I said, I did work in Oxford, in the town, but in the university, we know that sexual violence that's covered up, and people are complicit. It's the same thing about breaking down those particular walls of silence.
I think I echo everything that Anya says. I think for me it's about challenging attitudes. I think far too often we normalise the behaviour of perpetrators and victims. Young people go missing and they keep on going missing, or they commit crime and they keep on committing crime. It isn't normal for young people to behave in this way. Young people are born very innocent. So we need to think about breaking down this normalisation. We become desensitised to some of these issues. As professionals working in the safeguarding arena, we do become desensitised. But imagine what it must be like for that parent and for that young person. This has completely devastated and ruined their lives. And so we do need to think about challenging those attitudes, moving away from normalisation and desensitisation. And we need to instill confidence in professionals to be able to escalate their concerns. If they do have a concern, if they have a gut feeling that something isn't quite right, then the likelihood that is that something isn't quite right. And they should feel confident in being able to escalate that, and not being seen as a whistleblower or a troublemaker, but actually as being seen as a caring, passionate professional who wants to do the best for the young people within their community.
Yeah, just to go back to your question, I mean, as an LCB, I think one of the things that has changed recently is public health has become part of local authority, etc. And I think it's a public health agenda. And I think public health have to take it forward as an agenda. And therefore that it becomes part of education for, for all of our children. And that education isn't just about keeping, so often education focuses on the potential victim keeping themselves safe. Education for young people is also about keeping everybody safe in their relationships, including those who might be potentially, those boys that Alias was talking about earlier. It's about teaching, the education has to be in earlier, it has to be in primary schools, and it is a public health agenda, and I think that's really what has to be driven forward, because whenever, over many years of working, what I found is that we constantly return to early intervention, but early intervention gets drug up the scale and back up to high thresholds almost as quick as it's brought in. That actually, as soon as resources are short, the early intervention just becomes the intervention, and it's beyond the point where abuse has already happened. Thank you.
Do you want to add? Yeah. Of course.
I was trying to be good. I think for me, in terms of institutions, we need to challenge ourselves and have really robust systems in place and create an environment where the right people, or the people that have that knowledge and that experience, have the ability to raise their voices and have them heard. A few months ago I was talking to a colleague about the whole issue of sexual exploitation and Rotherham, etc., etc. And the question was asked whether I thought that something like that could happen here. I think my usual eye-rolling and kind of face-pulling kind of gave the game away. Yes, it can happen here if it's not already happening here. And I think the response I got was, well, in that case, people like you need to shout about it louder. What I wanted to say was, not too long ago, I was told, Shard, you know what the problem is, and why people don't listen to you, is not only are you a woman, but you're an Asian Muslim woman. And that is why your voice isn't heard. And I'm fairly confident that people would have got the perception or the understanding I'm not your typical shy, retiring, oppressed little woman. I'm quite capable of having my voice heard. I will shout, whether you listen or not is up to you. So I think we need to all take some responsibility and have those environments where we actually take on board when people are bringing their concerns to us. And I think, again, it has to be a cross-system process. Because, earlier on today, a few of us were at this other event about CSE. I think there were well over 100 people in that room looking at the issue of child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, and I think I was the only person from the whole region who has a remit around cohesion and community engagement in the room. And that was only because Mark had invited me to the event. So I'm thinking, we're talking about tackling this issue, but we're not looking at how we're going to talk to people and change mindsets and, hearts and stuff. So I just think there's a bigger game for us to play.
Also, if anyone's got any written questions, if they want to just pass them to the end, and we'll have some of the volunteers collecting them.
We'll just take a question from the text. Do you think if the media constantly hammers Muslims and Asians with sexual grooming, it distracts the attention to other non-Asian and non-Muslims who are doing this type of crime? P.S. The lady who spoke before was really brave. Assuming that's Stephen. Are they asked you to take this one?
I think this one, I think it's been covered quite well, the question.
Okay.
And yes, you're right, we want to protect children, and you protect children by making it clear that abusers come from all backgrounds. They use a whole range of different methods and mediums to abuse, to groom, to exploit, to abuse, to traffic. The models vary everywhere, and like I said, working nationally, I worked in Bradford where the perpetrators were Pakistani. I'm doing some work in Tower Hamlets where the perpetrators are Somali and Bengali. I worked in Liverpool on the States where the perpetrators were all white. There's a case in North Yorkshire at the moment again. So each of them have their own unique, different perspectives. And you know, if we perpetrate stereotypes and racialise crime, then what we do is we do not protect children.
I think we have covered it, but I think for me the danger is if we're only looking for one model, we're missing a whole group of perpetrators, we're missing a whole group of potential victims. If we're only looking for one thing, our attention is focused in one direction. So absolutely, the answer to the question is yes, the focus is being diverted, so we need to have a very wide vision and look out for all types of potential exploitation. I met with a police officer only the other day who said, no, I don't think I have the Rochdale Rotherham type abuse taking place on my patch. Well, perhaps not, but you've probably got different types of exploitation, so you need to be looking for other types of exploitation if you don't have evidence of this model of exploitation.
Got a question here for Alias. He said that you made the point about snitching. I'd like to ask, what would make people more confident to snitch on their abuser? Don't you think the punishment or the sentence of criminals related to the industry should be different? In other words, extended to make the victims feel they will be safe after they have snitched on the perpetrator?
Well, obviously I think the National Working Group has done quite a bit on this as well, around protecting victims and protecting witnesses as well. But you're absolutely right. I think, you know, we're talking about individuals who have a history of violence and criminality, who use violence and intimidation, threatening behaviour, have killed, have murdered, have threatened families, have damaged property. So you're right, it's very difficult for individuals to snitch and come forward, and you've got to be able to provide all the support networks holistically. And it doesn't just mean on an emotional level. We're talking about rehousing sometimes, we're talking about, you know, financial support, complete comprehensive support for individuals. I've got to say, sometimes you've literally got to take a person completely out of that environment, immerse them in a completely different new environment where 360 degrees, they have complete support available for them, and then you actually are able to actually pull someone away. Until you provide that complete wraparound, holistic care for the victims, then you'll always find there's a pullback, and it's difficult. It's very difficult sometimes to get the you know, and them being witnesses against the trials. And also, you know, there's been some remarkable breakthroughs, obviously from the CPS, from Nazir Azal, and in terms of the whole protection of witnesses as well, and the safeguarding of witnesses, who before were seen as unreliable. Because you've got to realise in the cross kind of examination of witnesses in all the trials we're talking about sometimes multiple barristers, you know, spending days and days cross-examining children, okay, and absolutely destroying and annihilating their character, okay, on the witness stand. So there's enormous amount of support, and where I think the agencies, I'm not from those agencies, but again I can say colleagues I know are getting there. I think perhaps you can say more about that.
Yeah, I agree. There is a lot of support out there for victims and witnesses of these types of crimes, but actually once the court process is over, that doesn't mean to say that the support doesn't have to continue. It has to continue into the long term, and it may have to continue for many years, because as we know, the damage is done and the damage will be long term. And so it is about appropriate accommodation, potentially taking a young person out of a situation and putting them into a completely new situation. The problem for me is far too many young people are being locked up in secure accommodation rather than perpetrators being locked up. And for some young victims, secure accommodation might be the most appropriate form of accommodation, because they are very high-risk, vulnerable young people. But actually, we need to be looking at more suitable accommodation and therapeutic provisions for these young people.
Yeah, it's a really complex question, because and the word snitching sounds it sounds like something in school and minor, and it's an appropriate word, and it is a word that's used, but actually the the risk to somebody snitching in a community where they're on the threat can be very great. Therefore, it is a major issue. And but having said that, certainly in our operation in Derby, one thing that I recall was that the belief of the police at that time was that the young people would not talk, and that they would not talk at all, and that if they were going to talk, they'd talk to youth workers or social workers. So they had all these people ready for when they made arrests, etc. What they found was that as soon as the arrests were made, the young people talked. And they actually started. Sometimes they couldn't snitch around their own abuse, they could snitch about each other's. They could talk about each other's, their concern for each other became the major issue. But sometimes young people surprise you, and actually, because they're in a belief system where, in fact, the police are the enemy, or the police don't have the power. And when that turns around, young people often change that position and are much more willing to talk to the police, etc. Then it is about the very things that my colleagues have just said about, is making sure that they are then protected through that process.
Just quickly on that as well, the other thing we've got to realise about the victims is that the victims are often criminalised. And these powerful groups that traffic them and abuse them will criminalise them, will implicate them in criminal venture, for the purpose of then using that as leverage and control over them. So it's difficult when someone has actually been involved themselves, perhaps in violence, in drug supply, carrying weapons, holding weapons, and various other things, for them then to obviously feel the confidence that they can report. So that's also part of the process. And then unfortunately, part of that criminalising is that sometimes victims themselves become perpetrators. And then what happens is that victims, in order to safeguard themselves, will either bring other children into grooming gangs so that they are abused rather than themselves. So it's very complex, and that's why the level of support and the level of interventions has to be massive. And one of the aspects of that is what I always say is it's so important that when victims see that their communities show solidarity with them against the abusers, and that means all the powerful people in there, elected members, police officers, imams, priests, whatever it is, those individuals have got to stand out and say quite clearly, we showed solidarity with the victims and we are there to safeguard and protect you. And one of the community models that we do use is that, where, because my workers are seen as credible, then they are the ones who say, look, we are going to look after you and we're going to make sure that you are protected. And that helps kind of in terms of the kind of pushing them away from criminal gangs.
I think the kind of whole issue about snitching is obviously kind of magnified when it's a young person, and I think for me personally one of the ways to address this is probably through peer support. I'm not sure if my colleagues from Bernardo's are still here. I think they might have gone. We've got a fantastic project here locally where 2 young women who are survivors of exploitation are now going out and delivering training to other young people, and these 2 young girls have been absolutely mind-blowingly inspirational. I mean, I think a couple of us in this room actually heard their presentation at police headquarters not too long ago, and just hearing their story from them directly, very similar to Nina's, but it really was challenging for everybody in that room to listen to. But what they wanted was very much to help support other victims, and they said when we went through the whole court process and whatever else, as much as Bernardo's and social workers were there for us, it was still very, very difficult. So we want to change things for other victims. So I think peer modelling and peer support is absolutely essential.
Thank you. We've got a question I'm just going to take from text. We've had quite a few similar ones to this. To an extent, there has been less of a focus on the perpetrators. Yes, we must work on early intervention, but it's equally important to understand the offenders just like the victims. Again, as mentioned throughout the session, it's been mentioned that this is not a race or religion issue. However, some would argue that this is particularly ethnic groups disproportionately involved in CSE, of which a high percentage of perpetrators aren't British born. Why is this the case? Is this down to mentality issues? And we'll take this first.
I didn't quite follow the whole of the question.
The main thing was about the mentality. Is it a case of mentality?
I do think that not enough is understood fully about some of the issues there to easily answer that question. I think that there are clearly some elements within culture that actually need to be looked at, and whether that actually is around how a culture functions and how a culture deals with its issues of gender and sexuality. I think that's important. But we do have to go back to a media coverage as well, in which that's the model we're looking at. And earlier, you know, was talked about the overall picture of child sexual abuse is very different than that. And why I put up the American statistics is because actually it just shows that actually the statistics are almost the same, and they're based in California. They don't make high media coverage there. And in fact, in some ways, the high media coverage has come out of the racial elements of why this story becomes a story, because it has a unique element to it. And that's what actually has drawn the media into it. But actually, we know that actually there is abuse, there's sexual exploitation. In a case in Derby, which we were dealing with, where it didn't fit that model, it got very, very little media coverage, even though the actual extent of exploitation, etc., within it was the same. So yes, there are issues, but I think it's very difficult to answer the question about any, you know, and we throw different cultures together. I mean, there's different conversations about why certain communities are completely absent from the conversation, but they are there. So it's actually, we know that it goes through all parts of society. So the other element that I would want to say is that offending behaviour is offending behaviour. And some of the offending behaviour, you know, those who work with sexual offending behaviour, which does cross all communities, I don't find anything particularly different about offending behaviour and how people represent themselves, whether they're Pakistani, whether they're British, whether they're Irish, or whether they're European. Actually, I don't find a particular difference in about how they justify their own behaviours. I find that they use very similar things. Yeah.
And you know, you might realise I was talking about crisis of masculinity. This is actually nothing to do with, I think, ethnicity. It's to do with fundamentally with masculinity. We are creating misogynistic men in our society. And I work with black, Asian, white kids, and their influences, as I said, they listen to the same music. The same music which refers to women in the most derogatory and sexually aggressive and violent language. And that's the main piece of their own language. They listen to this, watch the same type of porn. They have the same type of male role models. They grow up in the same kind of environment where there is violence. Sometimes they have similar experiences of being victims of violence themselves. There's actually nothing different between them. The social construction of their masculinity is exactly the same. And that's why I feel that, you know, this is much more to do with masculinity at the moment. And the second thing is, our discussion has to be based upon facts and evidence. We've got to look, and this is where when you have a national picture, not the media picture, the national picture of all of the child sexual exploitation and sexual abuse trials that are taking place in the UK at the moment, when you look at all of the trials taking place, then you get an accurate perspective. And the chief prosecutor has been very clear, 80 to 90% of those offences are committed by white indigenous males. Now that doesn't mean that we are in denial. And I'll make it sure, I'm not interested in any cover-up. You know, I face these issues in the Pakistani community, in Bangladesh, and many communities. I'm not interested in covering anything up. And I will, again, I've been involved in this way before this was an issue on the radar. Okay? However, you know, what doesn't help, and as I said, as a frontline practitioner, what doesn't help is when people fixate on this one model and they forget other models. And my approach is very simple. Any individual involved in this reprehensible crime needs to be apprehended and needs to be convicted and needs to be in prison. That's it. In terms of perpetrator work, we do perpetrator work, and it's very important, and there's different levels of perpetrator work, and there's just not enough work in terms of identifying potential perpetrators and then averting them away from falling into criminal behaviour, as well as rehabilitating existing perpetrators. We're just doing nowhere near enough in terms of that. So what often ends up happening, this is one of the biggest mistakes I find, especially with a lot of our young offenders who are gang affected. What they do is they often go to prison or a young offenders institute. Their index offence is going to be a drug or a violence or robbery or a theft related offence, but they've been involved in sexual violence. But that's not their index offence. That means that's not the offence for which they're being convicted. But they've been involved in sexual violence. And no one does any work with them around sexual violence. So when they come straight back out, the risk factors are still there. So there are lots of people who fall through the net, and we need to do much better work in terms of identifying potential perpetrators and working with existing perpetrators.
Again, I don't think there's much more I can add, because I don't know how many more ways there are of saying there is no one single profile for a perpetrator or for a victim. This happened across all communities, and it keeps going back to misogyny and patriarchy. Yes, you know, within some communities you would say, oh, they come across as being more kind of misogynist in the way that they treat women. But once you start unpicking some of the way that society treats women across the board, for me there isn't much difference. What is probably more difficult in some of the minority communities is that some of the victims within those communities find it more difficult to ask for help and kind of access support and feel that somebody would listen to them. So I think it's really important, as we keep saying this, and I think it's important that we keep repeating this, that unless we accept this is a cross-community issue and a cross-community problem and come up with a cross-community solution, we're going to talk about this forever and ever and ever without moving forward. And we can carry on blaming it's just those sort of people, but we're never going to address it unless we accept it happens across the board.
Thank you. Is there anyone from the audience that wants to ask a question? Pass it back over to the audience. Okay, we've got Daniel, if you could make your way down with the gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm a BBC News reporter. I work across the north of England. I've been trying to cover these issues in Middlesbrough for the last month. A lot of you have spoken about the importance of having an open, honest discussion about these issues. How important do you think the media is in that conversation? It's great that we can discuss it here tonight, but how important is the media in broadening that discussion out to the rest of the public here in Middlesbrough? And how important is it that the key agencies like the police and the council engage with us in that discussion? Because I've got to say, my experience here in the last month is that they don't want to. It's good to see a couple of police officers at the back here tonight, but as a body, Cleveland Police doesn't want to talk publicly about this issue at the moment. Mark Braithwaite's been very open and honest with us and has given us interviews which we're grateful for, but there's only so much he can tell us. We've been asking the police and the council to tell us a bit more about the work they're doing, and they don't want to as it stands. And it even seems, I can't prove this, but it seems like they've told other agencies and charities that are working around these issues here not to talk to us as well.
Thank you.
I think it's critical that the media are involved in terms of communicating messages around child sexual exploitation. And we've spoken at an event today where I talked a lot about the community awareness campaign that I talked about in a number of different areas, including South Yorkshire. I've been working very closely with the comms officers and the media teams to engage them and to make them understand what the issue of child sexual exploitation is, to make them understand some of the issues that we just talked about around ethnicity and breaking down barriers in terms of myths and stereotypes. And it's absolutely critical that the media are engaged in that approach. And we've been working with a number of different areas on multi-agency communications strategies, and that has to involve communications teams, it has to involve media teams, and we need to get that message out there, and we need to work collectively. I think for me it's about what would your agenda be in terms of reporting on this, and I think that needs to be an open and honest discussion as well. You know, why are you so interested in this subject, and what would your agenda actually be? If it's to build public confidence in services, then we can have that honest discussion. If it's to focus on one particular model, then we need to have that discussion as well. If it's to actually reflect an accurate picture and the true picture of what is happening nationally, then we can have that discussion as well. But actually we do need to collectively work with councils and police officers, and that's some of the work that I've been doing nationally, is to engage multi-agency audience, including comms officers, media teams, and those that can help us get the messages out there to the community. We've heard from one particular area today, a police force that covers 10 local authorities, and they've developed a website for the public, for young people as well, and they've had to engage with comms officers and media teams because they've got the capacity and the capability of getting the message out there to the public.
I'm not going to quite repeat what Bina said, but in similar ways, I think actually one of the effects sometimes of major investigations is to make the public service almost close down with the media, and because sometimes, like my elephant earlier in the room, sometimes the media are also very capable of just looking one direction all the time, and it can be a real struggle to get a wider story on. I know when our boss was on Newsnight, I think she had a real struggle to get on the issues about thinking about the young people. Post-Rotherham, the people who were least spoken about were the young people who were the victims themselves. Everything was about looking for heads and things like that. My own experience is that local media sometimes can be a real opener to get a wider public debate, and that local media has tremendous capacity when it comes to public health issues, about actually getting it out there and getting that community to talk about the issues, and sometimes even hearing the different debates from all sides of the political spectrum, that everybody's view being given validity by local media can be really useful in starting that debate and starting that working together towards caring about all the children. So I think I generally find local media is actually really a helpful thing, and sometimes that can then get back into a national media picture. But I think one always has to use the media because it is actually a way of getting that story to the biggest population.
Again, I think it just comes down to responsible media reporting. And I think for most people, it's the fear that it won't be responsible or kind of a fair portrayal of what is happening locally. As somebody who works quite closely with Cleveland Police and works on a part-time role with the council, I know there are some fantastic people working within both organisations who ultimately want to support victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation. But I think because this is such a fast-changing agenda and people are kind of learning almost on the spot, it's kind of trying to develop organisational structures and processes and be kind of clear in themselves before you let in a media who seems to kind of have a hidden agenda, and to, rather than causing harm, because I know previously when some stuff's gone into the media, I don't think the media necessarily thought about the impact on those victims and survivors, and how easily just naming somebody or just little clues will be kind of then impact, because things have happened locally where victims have then almost been found out when they haven't quite been ready to disclose. So I think it's very much a fear of the media, and I agree with everybody else. In order to get the message out there, we can't do this without the media. So it has to be a true and open and honest kind of partnership.
I think we've got a question in the audience down here. We've got enough time for probably another 3 or 4 questions. I think we're going to have to get a couple of people in this panel to answer each one from now, so we get through a bit more.
Thank you. Charlie Rooney, I'm a Middlesbrough councillor, and I take exception at the fact that the BBC reporter said the council didn't respond to his inquiries. I'm very surprised at that. If he contacts us, I'm sure we will respond. We had a recent public scrutiny on this very subject. It was delayed. It started before the Rotherham issue came to the headlines. It was delayed because of the Rotherham issue to take account of that report, and that looked at everything we've been talking about tonight, including all the multi-agency work we should be doing. The report was even titled, "It's Everybody's Problem," so I agree with everything that's been said tonight, with the exception of the BBC reporter there, who seems to have been talking to the wrong people. I really don't know who he's talking to. Interviews were offered after the event. The scrutiny chair talked to a lot of the media, and we are willing to talk to the media about this very problem. There were 2 young men that came to the meeting who tried to twist the debate onto the ethnicity issue. They quoted some spurious statistics about it being 75% Asian, and that was all about the publicity, and that's all they're reading. I think what the BBC and other media outlets could do is publish what they hear today. At the end of every article about abuse, they should publish that 80 to 90% is white, because it's just the truth, and that's all we want from the media, is the truth. As I say, the report said it's everybody's problem. I think it is everybody's problem, and we are willing to talk about it. I can't speak for anybody else, but the council has been in the public arena about it and will continue to be so.
I think as IDC there, we've just struck up a brand new partnership between the council and BBC, so we'll take the credit for that if it does go ahead. So you guys can exchange numbers afterwards, right? Fantastic. I've got a question. Does anyone from the audience want to ask a question yet? We've got a question at the back there.
Yeah, there's been a strong focus on sexual exploitation and abuse taking place in gangs, a lot of like city areas and stuff like that. Picking up on what Shada said about victims being from no single category and from all backgrounds, what happens to girls who are not on the streets, who are suffering from abuse and sexual exploitations behind closed doors? They don't have any little or any access to services, who's supporting them?
This comes down to awareness and education again. It's educating the young people about where they can access support. First of all, the support needs to be in place, and that's critical. And then it's about advertising where they can actually get that support, having a helpline in place, for example, educating them about the issue and for them to know where to go. It's also about educating and training parents so that they know what the issues are, so that they can respond to them at home. And we always talk about the fact that looked after children are sexually exploited, so young people within children's homes. But actually the young people in children's homes, they're known to services, they have access and are already within those services. And all those professionals around that young person has had safeguarding training, will know about sexual exploitation, will have attended training events. But actually the parents that are at home that don't work in the safeguarding arena, what training and awareness have they had? So it's really important that we do education and training with young people and parents and carers. And there is an organisation, a national organisation that works to support parents and carers of sexually exploited children and young people. And it's called PACE, Parents Against Child Exploitation. It's based in Leeds, but they have a national remit, and they do have free online training available to all parents and carers. So it's about generating discussion amongst young people and parents about what is safe, what is healthy, then knowing where to signpost them and where to seek support once they've identified that something isn't quite right.
Could we have anyone else want to comment on that?
It certainly isn't our intention as an NWG to focus strictly on street grooming. That's why we talk about different models, and I think there is work to be done in communities about and that's the direction. In some ways the other conversations are about that actually we need to move towards a more thorough curiosity about what's happening in young people's life, and see up in another group what's happening in young people's life, how they're living them, and therefore to be able to pick up on the vulnerabilities for young people who are in their own homes as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you were just talking about general abuse or within particular communities, but for me, I think the biggest issue is around kind of raising people's awareness, and I think in my presentation I didn't quite get to the end of it because Zach was hassling. I think the need for kind of education is absolutely of most vital importance, but in terms of projects, I don't think we have enough organisations locally that have that awareness around some of the specific issues. But I think work has started to happen. I think over the last couple of years, I've been working with an organisation called MTEP, who are kind of part of IDC, as well as with Bernardo's and with Cleveland Police, as well as our 5 local mosques, but not all of them have kind of been engaged, but we're trying to, as well as other faith groups, kind of look at how we can best raise people's awareness in order to kind of get that trust out there. We had some safeguarding training which took place at one of the mosques, and it was a really interesting experience because we had some of the teachers there who taught children, and when we went through the training, initially they were saying, well, we can't possibly talk to about children about this and whatever, and it kind of stuck in my mind. One of the women had said, last year, one of the young girls that I was teaching came to me and wanted to talk to me about something of this nature, and straight away I shut her down because, this isn't a comfortable subject matter for me. But once she'd been on that training and she had a little bit more understanding, she said, next time somebody comes to me, I'll know what to do. And it's going to take a long time in terms of having safe spaces where people feel comfortable that they will be listened to. But I think there is a lot of good work that's happening locally amongst all the different organisations, but there's still a lot we can do, and I think the missing link is always listening to the voices of the people who've actually gone through it. So yeah, as I said, we just have to carry on working together.
Thank you. Have you got anyone else from the audience who wants to ask a question? We've got a lady at the top there.
I just wanted to ask, it's been really interesting everything that we've heard tonight, and certainly there have been other training events I've been to where there's a lot of information about signs and indicators, things to look for with victims of sexual exploitation. But particularly as a mother of an adult son now, and I was the mother from hell because he wasn't allowed to have Grand Theft Auto, and I certainly monitored, you know, the kind of things that he had access to. How much targeted work is there, or what training is available or information is available for parents and professionals to look for signs and indicators of sexual exploitation amongst perpetrators, particularly for parents?
I think locally the Children's Safeguarding Board offer a range of training opportunities, but I think they are predominantly aimed at professionals. But I think we've started a conversation with Mark and some of his colleagues about some training for community organisations. One of the things I do for my sins is coordinate Ministerial Interfaith Network, and that's working with a range of faith organisations right across the town, and we want to try and organise an event for early in the new year to focus on this issue, to try and get more awareness out there, to equip people with the right tools, because I think at the moment the majority of the work that's happening is kind of aimed and focused on practitioners rather than Joe Public, and I think that's definitely something that we need to build on locally.
And I think the short answer from me is that there isn't. You know, unfortunately, what we do is we take an approach where we know there are warning signs, and I've got to say, most mothers out there, and this, we've got to put context to this. And the urban context in which I work, where there are challenging family circumstances, often single-parent families, or even when there are two-parent families, the father is often absent and not fully engaged, socioeconomic issues, living in a high-crime area, gang issues, and what we're not finding is that, you know, there's that kind of quality interaction with children and with boys in particular. And so what happens is many of the warning signs are not being picked up. And then when warning signs are picked up, the nature of our kind of intervention services, unless it's acute crisis or they actually commit criminality or antisocial behaviour, until they actually do bad things, then the system kicks in. And so I had a 15-year-old who, you know, obviously he was a great kid, but, you know, no one picked up the warning signs until he's involved in drug supply, in criminality, in violence, in gun knife, until he's there, and then 15, 16 workers were then dissecting every part of his life. And then he rebelled against it even more. So it's bizarre that we're not, I don't think we are providing that early intervention and support for families, you know, who pick up. And the way, often I get calls from mums all hours of the day, my workers do as well, and they say, we just heard about you, and we don't know who you really are, we heard about you, we heard you'll come and talk to my son. And that's really as simple as that. I'm really worried about him. And she said, I had to talk to about 3 or 4 or 5 people, and then eventually got to you, will you come and talk to my son? I think he's hanging around with a bunch of kids, and I don't like what he's up to. He's, you know, he's smoking, or, you know, there's various other things. And it's a cry for help. And we're not listening to those cries for help. And I think austerity, I know this is probably the last question, but austerity is a biggie. We've got public sector cuts all around the country, and I've got to make it absolutely clear, when we cut services, it means more children will fall through the net. So, elected members here, okay, we actually had a motion in Bradford Council, we have full council on Tuesday this week, I'm an independent councillor. We passed a motion around child sexual exploitation, and it was all about vigilance, and it's good. We're passing motions, we're saying that this is on the radar, but it's got to be matched by resources that go to the hard end, and supporting, like I said, mothers, women out there, families out there, so that people feel that they have the confidence to come out and intervene as early on as possible.
I said it last time, so yes, I think it's right. There's very little out there, you know, and parents are asked for a diligence around their young people that is incredibly difficult to carry out. But touching on the political and the austerity, we are heading up into an election phase, and actually, it's democracy, and I guess every party in the sun will be voted by people in this room in different ways. What I would say to all of you, whatever your persuasion, is the decimation of youth services has been appalling over the past government, and actually put it as an agenda to whoever your choice of elected person is around there, to put it as an agenda that you want to see these things improved. I accept that there are major issues around the elderly, but actually, without investing in the youth, you will be doing the elderly a major disservice as well, and if you don't invest in them, then we will continue, they will cost a lot more down the line.
I think we've got just enough time for one more question. So we've got a lady at the back. The last question, guys.
I know we've been talking about resources and things in our community, but has anyone talked or thought about going into schools and educating, like telling the teachers about it and getting teachers to talk about it? If teachers talk about it, it opens doors for students to talk about it. You know, if they see it as acceptable and not a scary situation or not a scary subject, then it'll open up for young people to talk about it as well, and if they are victims, it might make them feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I think locally we've had Bernardos who have been doing this sort of training for a number of years in most of the schools in Middlesbrough, but I think it really needs to be kind of resourced and supported, because I know every so often they get funding and then they go and do some work in a particular school, then there isn't any funding, then it stop again. So it is a stop-start process. But I think we've got to the stage now where we need to think of really innovative ways. I think there's been a lot of talk about social media and some of the abuse that's going on via social media. And again, I know Cleveland Police have been doing some work on this, but there's more work to be done. And I totally agree with you. You know, it has to be, for me, a multi-pronged approach. One within the schools, talking to the young people, talking to practitioners, but also talking to the wider community, including the parents as well. This isn't something one organisation can take the responsibility for, but it very much needs to be resourced. And I know that's painful for people to hear in the current climate where everything's just been cut to the bone, but, you know, things have to be done.
I think getting education and schools on board is absolutely critical, because that's where the early signs and the early indicators can be identified. We think about universal services, we think about health, we think about education. Those are the places where young people are going. Schools, they should be going on a daily basis to school. And if there is a change in behaviour, or if there is change in appearance, or if there are vehicles outside the school gates waiting for these young people, or if they become disruptive, then those are the signs and indicators that schools and teachers need to be aware of. So there's absolutely, it's critical that they are trained and are made aware of some of these signs and indicators. And if you think about Daniel Pelker was a young boy that was murdered. But he went to school, he was looking very dishevelled, and he was rummaging around in the bins looking for food at school. Now, the school didn't pick up on that, and they didn't share that information with their partner organisations. Schools have a very, very good opportunity to identify those early signs and indicators and do some of that prevention work, so it's critical. Eileen Munro said in her review of child protection that theatre and drama is one of the most effective ways of engaging young people, and you've just talked about innovative ways of engaging young people. We need to think about social media, but also there are drama groups and drama productions out there who are focusing specifically on the issue of child sexual exploitation. And yes, it's about funding these drama groups and commissioning them, but actually it's having a massive impact. And I know that one particular drama company have reached thousands of young people and are receiving disclosures on a daily basis on the back of these theatre productions. So it's really key that we do engage these different mediums.
Could I have just one more comment on that, guys?
Yeah, I've just to say that in the tea break, interestingly enough, I spent a conversation with a member of a local organisation around a plan down the line to start training in primary schools in Middlesbrough, along with Bernardo's, and we actually agreed that we would make contact, and that following tonight's event we would look at how we can support in developing a training programme around primary schools.
Just quickly, I'm going to be really quick. You know, sex and relationship education in schools, and I think on a national level, is an abject failure. It completely fails in equipping our young people with the skills to negotiate really, really challenging issues around consent, abusive relationships, appropriate behaviour, sexual violence. We're not even having that conversation. Most young people have 3 45-minute lessons, and when I ask them what they covered, it's just the reproductive aspects, STIs, condom use, unwanted pregnancies, and what they want is a mature discussion with an older person, an open, safe space, mature discussion which enables them to negotiate these really challenging issues. And I'd like it to be seen that every young person has access to that one-to-one mentoring so that they can actually talk about the emotions. And self-esteem is the most critical aspect of giving them. Self-esteem and moral compass are the 2 critical things that I think needs to be put into that kind of education package to help young people negotiate these issues.
Sorry, 30 seconds. I think schools are absolutely key. I think earlier on today we heard a video testimony from a victim from Rochdale. You know, traditionally we think abuse happens late at night in takeaways and wherever else. These young girls were being picked up from school, and where the parents think they're just out at the library or meeting a friend. And I can remember when I was young, and you know, guys in cars were coming to pick up girls from school. So it's definitely an issue. And can I just urge everybody just to YouTube Amanda Todd and listen to her story. It's an American young woman, and what happened to her, and it's just the way that we as a society blame victims and the impact that has. And for me, we have to keep going back to the justice for victims and change things for the better.
You ran over. I'll let you go. Okay, just to wrap up, guys, we need a couple of minutes. Your attention for just a couple more minutes. First and foremost, we've got a sheet here. We've got a charity week coming up from Teesside University. If anyone wants to help with street collections, there's forms out the back at both reception desks. If you do want to help with street collections for orphans around the world, please sign up there. Other thing is, you've all got evaluation sheets on your desk. Please fill them out so we know what we can improve for the events, what was good, what was bad, and you know what you want to see in the future. And then we've got gift boxes for everyone at the back. And I want to finish this event slightly differently. And that's, I want to finish on a famous story from the Islamic tradition, from my tradition. And I believe that even if you don't follow a particular religion, I think we can always take messages from these narratives and these stories. And it's about a man called Zayd ibn Amr. We're going to call him Zayd. And he was a man that died before Islam actually came about. He was a man who went against the tide. And he was a man who chose not to worship idols, which was the prevalent religion at that time. But for our purposes, and most importantly, he was a man who stood up against injustice. And it was well known that before Islam, the Arabs had a tradition called female infanticide, meaning that they took their baby girls into the desert. They dug a ditch and they buried them alive. And they waited for their hands to go limp, and then they left and went back to their lives as if nothing had happened. And this man, Zayd, he would stand in the middle of Mecca and he would say that if you do not want to look after your children, give them to me and I'll look after them and I'll care for them and I'll bring them up. But Zayd passed away in the Islamic tradition before the Prophet Muhammad received revelation. And his son converted to Islam after the Prophet Muhammad gave the message of Islam to him. And he came to the Prophet Muhammad and he said, "What is the status of my father?" Because he came about before Islam was here. And I want you to listen to what the Prophet Muhammad said and how he elevated his status. He said that on that day, as Muslims believe, there's going to be a day of judgment where we're going to be judged for what we did, whether we did good or whether we did bad. And everyone is going to be gathered behind the person that they followed, whether that was a prophet or the person that they followed. He said that your father, he will stand unto a nation unto himself. He will stand there by himself as a whole nation. This is the status that Islam gave to a man who stood up for those children that had no one to stand up for them. And this is what we should strive to be. We should all be a bit like Zayd and be that person that stands up against injustice no matter what community it's from, and be that person who protects our children. And on behalf of IDC, I'd like to thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to have a massive round of applause for our panel, please. I'd like to thank the media for showing up and covering this positive interaction and event. Again, please fill out your evaluation forms. I hope it's been a beneficial event for you. Have a fantastic night and a safe journey home. Thank you and good night.